Good afternoon. My name's Peter Holland, and I'm the Associate Dean for the Arts in the College of Arts and Letters, and it's my genuine pleasure to welcome you to the first of this season's Saturday Scholars. As I'm sure many of you know, every game day we have such an event at which we try to remind people that there's more to life than tailgating and that the university has other things going on the rest of the time, and to give you a chance to meet and listen to and ask questions of and have discussion with some of our most outstanding teachers. And let me just simply run through what's going to happen later in the season. On 21st of September, the Michigan State game, Tom Maluzzi, who's a professor in the Department of Psychology, will be talking about letting go, ancient to modern perspectives on relinquishing personal control. For the Oklahoma game on the 28th of September, Zig Baranski, professor of Italian, is going to be talking about Dante and the birth of modern literature. The USC game on the 19th of October, Robert Sedlak, in the Department of Art History and Design, is going to be talking about implementing social change, a collaborative design project in South Africa. For the Navy game on the 2nd of November, Larry Cunningham is going to be talking about the chapels of Notre Dame. And the final home game against Brigham Young on the 23rd of November has a second panel. David Campbell, Vincent Munoz, and Matthew Holland, no relation to me, who's president of Utah Valley University, are going to talk together about, did Mitt Romney's Mormonism cost him the White House? Stained glass ceilings and American politics. I think it's a pretty good lineup, but then I created it. One of the things that I realized early on as we were planning this season's events was that this was, of course, a remarkable year for the papacy. The mere idea that we would have two popes alive at the same time was a phenomenal change. And where better than at Notre Dame to find experts who would want to talk about exactly this transition from Pope Benedict to Pope Francis. So our three speakers, who are going to be a panel, and each of them is going to talk just for a few minutes, and then they'll talk together and then take some questions. Our three speakers are, and I can't actually see from here the order in which their name places are, so it doesn't really matter. First, Kathleen Sprows Cummings, is the William and Anna Jean Cushwa Director of the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism here at Notre Dame. She's also an associate professor of American Studies. Her first book, New Women of the Old Faith, Gender and American Catholicism in the Progressive Era, appeared in 2009, and she's co-edited a volume with Scott Appleby, Catholics and the American Century, Recasting Narratives of U.S. History, that appeared from Cornell last year. She's working on a new book called Citizen Saints, Catholics and Canonization in American Culture, obviously designed you hear the euphony of Catholics and canonization in American culture, a project which is so exciting that she received an NEH fellowship to pursue it. Cyril O'Regan is one of the two Catherine Huisking professors of theology. Our other speaker, Brian Daley, is the other Catherine Huisking professor of theology. Cyril was educated in his native Dublin, and then, I'm sorry to say, at Yale, after a while came to Notre Dame. His areas of expertise are in systematic and historical theology, and amongst his books are The Heterodox Hegel, published in 1994, Gnostic Apocalypse, Jacob Boehmer's Haunted Narrative, which appeared in 2002, and Theology in the Spaces of the Apocalyptic, which appeared in 2009. The first volume of a two-volume project called Anatomy of Misremembering, Balthasar and the Spectre of Hegel, is just about to appear from Crossroad, and the second volume should appear next year. And our third, final, last, but certainly by no means least speaker is Father Brian Daley. Father Daley is a Jesuit, studied in Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, and taught for 18 years in the Western Jesuit School of Theology in Cambridge, Mass, before coming to Notre Dame in 1996. Among his publications are Companions in the Mission of Jesus, The Hope of the Early Church, a handbook of patristic eschatology, and a number of extremely important translations. Amongst the honours he has received, one is to have been the honorand of a Festschrift, something that was a great academic tradition, now alas dying out, but the point at which one's colleagues and students gather together to present one with a volume of essays. But it's the second honour which makes him somehow especially appropriate to our panel today, since last year he received the Ratzinger Prize in Theology from Pope Benedict himself. So let me welcome our three speakers to the platform and to our topic, From Pope Benedict to Pope Francis, Contrasts and Continuities. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank all of you for coming. And thank you, Peter, especially for your gracious introductions. I always wonder on these occasions whether this has any relationship to the speakers themselves, but it's nice to have this aura at least generated. We thought the other day together about how we would approach the subject today from Pope Benedict to Pope Francis. And since I am a Jesuit, I think the thought was I had drawn the short straw that I should speak first and say something about Pope Francis, at least due to the fact that he is the first Jesuit pope in the history of the Catholic Church. That may not seem so strange. We've had Dominican popes and Franciscan popes and Benedictine popes, popes of all different religious traditions, religious communities, but there has never been a Jesuit pope. And the assumption of most Jesuits that I grew up with myself, from high school in fact, is that there never would be a Jesuit pope, that somehow this isn't what we do in the church, and that even if we wanted to do it, nobody else would want us to do it. So there are a lot of people who criticize the Society of Jesus, many others who support them, and also it is a tradition in the society that goes back to our founder, St. Ignatius, to avoid ecclesiastical office unless we're actually commanded to accept one. So normally speaking, you don't find Jesuit bishops or other people in ecclesiastical office unless they are actually commanded by the Holy See to accept this. So we didn't expect a Jesuit pope. How has he turned out so far? And I suppose that's the real thing that we're talking about today. I think he's turned out very well. I'm immensely impressed and delighted, but there may be other opinions here. And also surprised. I was in Rome at the time that Pope Francis was elected, by sheer coincidence. I was giving some lectures at a Jesuit institute there, the Oriental Institute, which deals with Eastern Christianity. And it happened to be the same week that the conclave was meeting. This had been set up weeks, months in advance, and there was no intended coincidence. But people said to me, well, if something happens, if white smoke appears over the Vatican, you'll hear it because the bells will start to ring all over Rome. And in the meantime, just go ahead and do your thing. Give your classes and your lectures and let them take care of things. Let the cardinals elect their man. So on the Wednesday night of that week when we were there, it was about 7:45, I think. I had supper and gone back to the room I was staying in, working on my class for the next day. All of a sudden, the bells of St. Mary Major's Church across the street began to peal, and everything became very excited. So it was the signal that something had happened over in the Vatican. And I ran down to the TV room in the Jesuit community there that I was staying in, as most everybody else in the community did. We all converged there, and the TV was on, and we were really waiting for news. And if you remember, it took about an hour before anything became clear. The announcement had been made, but no one had appeared on the balcony of St. Peter's to tell us who it was who had been elected. So we sat there kind of in some suspense, waiting to hear exactly what had happened. And then when the Cardinal Deacon came out finally, about an hour, that it was Cardinal Bergoglio from Buenos Aires, who everyone knew was a Jesuit. There was stunned silence in the room, a deep inhaling of breath, And that was about it. And I think going through everybody's mind was, really? Has this happened? Yeah. And then the second question was, well, is this good news or is it bad news? We'll have to wait and see. But I think most everyone's impression by the end of that news report was to be deeply, deeply touched and to feel this does seem to be good news for all of us. When Cardinal Bergoglio, now Pope Francis, came out on the balcony and made his famous introduction of himself, asked to be blessed by the crowd there before he blessed them, and spoke to them in very simple terms of being sent to be their bishop. I think we began to feel that there is a different tone and style already present in the papal office, and that this was significant. And to me, the changes, and maybe my colleagues would not entirely agree, but so far the changes that we've seen in Pope Francis have been largely changes of style. But style is important. Marshall McLuhan used to say, the medium is the message. And I think for all of us that's true, that the way we present ourselves, communicate our ideas, speak to people about what we think is precious and important is almost as important as the content itself, because it is really part of what we want to say. As we've seen, Pope Francis has deliberately chosen to live simply, to live in a kind of Vatican hotel, to dress more simply than popes have done in recent memory, and to emphasize over and over again that the church is really there for the people, for the service, especially of the poor, the marginalized, the forgotten, to those, the service of those to whom we traditionally have reached out and to whom Jesus reached out, as far as we know, in his own time. He certainly does not seem to be a person who is going to make major changes in doctrine or policy, but rather someone who will encourage his fellow bishops and priests to do what they do for the sake of poor and marginalized people in a way that communicates that we also share your poverty and share a concern for your welfare. In his famous homily on Holy Thursday, I think the Pope expressed this agenda very well in saying to a group of priests from Rome gathered in St. Peter's that the real danger of being a cleric, of being a priest or a bishop, is clericalism, is the fact that clerics tend to be self-referential in what they do. They're not only doing the work of Christ, but doing it in a way that in some sense claims rank or privilege or respect. And he warned against that because this can become then a hidden excuse for self-service and self-promotion. There's a kind of demythologizing of the clergy going on, which I think is really important for all of us. And I would say that there's something very Jesuit about that, going back to St. Ignatius and his spiritual exercises too. What I see and hear in Pope Francis is very much the spirituality of the Society of Jesus as presented in the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius and as shared by many, many Christians, not just Jesuits. An emphasis on humility, the gift of self, and the service of the poor. I don't want to say too much more, but I think I should share one thing with you, that we had a visitor in my community, my Jesuit community here, just this past week from Buenos Aires, a Jesuit we know quite well who works there as a political scientist. And he knows Cardinal Bergoglio as the local archbishop. Many of his confreres know him well because he was provincial of the Jesuits in Argentina for 6 years back in the 1970s. And we said, well, okay, what is he really like? What do people think about him in Argentina? And Rodrigo is his name, told us, well, obviously you'll get different opinions, but most people understandably are very excited. The newspapers almost every day has something about this new Argentine Pope. But he says you have to understand Argentine society to understand him. Most people involved in public life, he said, are peronistas, are people who in some sense share in the tradition and the style of Juan Perón, who was the president, and in some sense the dictator of Argentina back in the 1950s and 60s. To be a Peronista, as I understand it, is a kind of to be a populist, to be someone who doesn't simply deal with the aristocracy, but who tries to speak to the ordinary people, to unions and to crowds, and to stir them up. But as Rodrigo told us, there are Peronistas on the right and Peronistas on the left. The present president of Argentina, President Kirchner, is really a Peronista on the left. She's a socialist in her economic theories and using the Peronista style to revise the economic positions of the government. His take is that Cardinal Bergoglio, now Pope Francis, is a classic Peronista of the right, that he's someone whose commitment is to more classical Christian policies and doctrines and teachings, but to do this in a rather populist, open way, a way that can speak to ordinary people, and sees that the important thing is to win the support of ordinary people. He really does live poorly, Rodrigo told us. This is known for years. He really did take the bus to work, do his own cooking, and wear very simple clothes. He genuinely is someone who wants to live simply and poorly. And he genuinely speaks to ordinary people on the street and to the newspaperman and to everybody else in a very informal way. His style is very much a simple one. But he is a strong leader. He's someone who expects loyalty, who expects commitment, who perhaps is somewhat suspicious of academics because they tend to be self-referential in their ways, who sees that the church is basically there for little people, and therefore gets impatient when people let the church be about the wealthy or the admired. In some ways, as Rodrigo described him, it sounds very much like Pope John Paul II in his style. He had different interests, perhaps, but a style that reached out beyond the altar rail and beyond the sanctuary to ordinary people, to call them to deeper identification with the style of Jesus. And we could say more about that, perhaps, but I think I ought to hand on to my colleagues, to Kathleen.
Thanks, Brian. I'm delighted to be here today, and I'm speaking to you this afternoon from the perspective I'm a historian of Catholicism in the United States. And from that perspective, the recent papal transition has been absolutely fascinating in a number of aspects. The first one I want to talk about is not who was elected, but who might have been elected, at least according to the conventional wisdom in the weeks leading up before the conclave. Do you know that if you did a Google image search for American Pope at any point before last February, the first hit would be a cartoon that was published on September 5th, 1894, that was very popular in the United States. It showed a caricature of Cardinal Satolli, who was then the apostolic delegate, the papal representative to the United States, sitting on top of a huge dome that looked suspiciously like St. Peter's, but was labeled American headquarters, and casting a huge shadow over a map of the United States. And the shadow was not in the shape of Cardinal Satolli, it was in the shape of Pope Leo XIII. And this appeared in a decade when there was a particularly virulent strain of anti-Catholicism in American culture. Now, if you did a Google image search for American Pope today or since last March, you'll never get to this cartoon. You'll find it, you just need to be more specific. You need to enter the date. But you will find multiple images of Cardinal Sean O'Malley of Boston, and in particular, New York's Cardinal Timothy Dolan. And that reflected, again, the widespread predictions that both men stood a reasonable chance of being elected in the conclave. I think those predictions were rooted much more in wishful thinking than they were in reality. Nevertheless, it's absolutely fascinating when you consider that for most of our nation's history, there has been such skepticism attached on the part of many non-Catholics as to whether Catholics could be both loyal citizens in a democracy and also profess loyalty to a foreign despot like Pope Leo XIII. And this is not, it didn't disappear in the 1890s. These kinds of theories dogged Al Smith when he ran for president in 1928, and even John F. Kennedy as late as 1960. So in that sense, it's a fairly quick turnaround that the prospect of an American pontiff was viewed so positively by Catholics and non-Catholics in this country. If religious prejudice has been one prominent theme in the history of Catholics in America, another more pronounced theme has been internal debate among Catholics over the terms Catholic and American. Not about whether it was possible to combine those two identities, but what it meant. And over the course of history, there have been many disagreements on this question, many disagreements on a variety of issues. But they're often centered on a tension that has long been at the heart of the American Catholic experience, and that is the tension between living in a society and culture that thrives on change, that adapts very easily, changes very quickly, and being part of a religious tradition that measures change in centuries. And again, this tension between American innovation and Catholic tradition have collided and have created a lot of internal debate among Catholics. And I think in that sense, that is really a key to Pope Francis's extraordinary popularity in this country so far, not universally, but still an overwhelmingly positive reaction. It is relatively rare in Catholic circles to witness events that have no precedent. And we had such a dizzying array of them last winter, the almost unprecedented papal resignation, followed by the election of a surprising choice who represented a first in so many ways, the first Jesuit, the first Francis, the first American, not from the United States, but nonetheless from the Western Hemisphere. And there has been a lot of speculation about what change this portends, what change is on the horizon. In the words of the usually measured Vatican analyst John Allen, he described it as a revolution. He also just yesterday talked about Pope Francis rebooting the Vatican. It's also worth remembering that by definition, there's really no such thing as a Vatican outsider within the College of Cardinals, and that changes in style do not necessarily translate to changes in substance. Nevertheless, as Brian said, several things have become clear, and one of them is that for many U.S. Catholics, these changes in style have been enough substance. Francis' embrace of a simple dress and lifestyle, which Brian just mentioned, and there's also the unmistakable appeal of the regular guy. Unlike his predecessor, Pope Francis does not come across as too scholarly, and that has always been a plus in our country, whether you're a politician, a pope, or even sometimes a college professor. U.S. Catholics particularly resonate with Pope Francis's openness, manifested this summer in his impromptu press conference on the way home from Brazil. And I'd like to focus on two moments in that conference, both of which illustrate a dynamic around which the remainder of my comments are framed, and that is continuity in the sense of the two papacies and in the sense of Catholic tradition and teaching, but at least the potential this papacy seems to suggest that it may lead the Catholic Church in this country in new directions, at least when compared to the context of, at least within the context of the last 50 years. The first moment I want to talk about has to do with Pope Francis's response to a question from a Brazilian journalist who asked him why he didn't speak either about abortion or same-sex marriage at World Youth Day, especially considering that Brazil had recently passed laws widening access to both. Pope Francis, I quote, "The Church has already spoken quite clearly on this. It was unnecessary to return to it, just as I didn't speak about cheating, lying, or other matters on which the Church has a clear teaching. Instead," he said, he decided to focus on positive things that open up the path to young people. Besides, young people know perfectly well what the Church's position is. It's interesting to think about the potential impact of this way of thinking on the Church in the United States. And based on my own experience with the Notre Dame students, I think he's definitely onto something in acknowledging that young Catholics are quite clear on Church teaching on matters such as abortion, same-sex marriage, and might benefit from hearing more about what the Church says, the many things the Church says yes to, rather than what it says no to. For example, I hear comments from my students all the time when they first learn about Catholic social teaching. Why didn't I know about this sooner? It's a very positive experience generally. Speaking more broadly, there's no question that issues related to sexuality have dominated American political discourse since the late 1960s, a decade shaped by the cataclysmic coincidence of the Second Vatican Council and American social movements, a period which historians are still trying to interpret. Foregrounding these particular issues set U.S. Catholics on trajectories that diverge significantly from their previous experience in this country, eroding, for example, their century-long alliance with the Democratic Party, also prompting them to forge alliances with members of some of the very same religious groups who were among the most virulent anti-Catholics as late as the 1940s. I think, too, in the recent issue that has received a lot of publicity, and that is the Vatican doctrinal assessment of women religious. One of the critiques within that document was that women religious American women religious have not been doing enough to foreground, to talk about church teaching on these issues. So perhaps that might lead to some movement there. Now, I want to emphasize that suggesting that the Pope's words may create new patterns in some aspects of American life is far different from forecasting any change in that teaching. And any ambiguity on that subject was cleared up in a follow-up question the same reporter asked the Pope, in which she asked him to clarify his own position on abortion and same-sex marriage. He said, the position of the church. I am a son of the church. I mean, it was almost as if she was asking, is the Pope Catholic? That joke that we say. He was very gracious about it, but nevertheless, it was kind of a humorous moment. Another moment in the same conference that illustrated this dynamic of continuity in terms of church teaching, but change in an American context, is when the Pope was asked to elaborate on comments he had made earlier about women in the church. Here again, the Pope made very clear what was not going to change. As far as women's ordination was concerned, he said, the church has spoken and said no. That door is closed. Pope Francis was referring there to a 1994 declaration by Pope John Paul II that did indeed declare the subject closed, not open to discussion. That said, Pope Francis effectively opened another door in the same conversation in which he noted, we have not yet come up with a profound theology of womanhood in the church. All we say is, they can do this, they can do that. Now they are altar servers, now they do the readings, they are in charge of Caritas, but there is more. We need to develop a profound theology of womanhood. This is another instance in which Pope Francis's words could signal a departure from the American Catholic experience of the last 50 years. Nowhere has the historic tension between American innovation and Catholic tradition collided more spectacularly than in regard to the role of women. Over the last 50 years, transformations for women in American society have far outpaced transformations for women's roles within the Catholic Church, and there has been not a whole lot of pastoral response to that or conversation about it. In the process of not talking about women's ordination, Catholics in America have not discussed much else with regard to women and the church. Just to give one example, in 1983, U.S. bishops agreed to write a pastoral letter on women. 9 years and 4 drafts later, they abandoned the project. It was just too hard. This is hardly the only example of a conversation about women in the church that never quite got off the ground. And I think these conversations are not happening at the parish level, the diocesan level, and not even often enough in Catholic universities. I teach a class here called Women in American Catholicism. And on the first day of the semester last year, one student announced that she had signed up for the class simply out of curiosity. I am dying to know, she said, she was quite dramatic, how a course on this topic could last any longer than 2 weeks. Women cannot be ordained in the Catholic Church. What could we find to talk about? This student was a senior at Notre Dame who had attended Catholic schools all her life, but she had no lens through which to view the history of women in the church except through the lens of ordination. So I think what Pope Francis has done in calling for the development of a profound theology of women, I think he's really opened a path to say that it's not only okay to have these kinds of conversations, but that it's actually necessary. To refer back to his earlier phrase, opening a positive path to young people, I certainly think it would do that particular student, she did last the entire semester, by the way, and countless other young Catholic women, to listen to what Francis said. And here again, I quote him from the press conference. The role of women in the church must not be limited to mothers, workers, a limited role. The development, those were his words. And of course, the development of a profound theology of womanhood has the potential not just to shape young women, but many people within the church. I think it does bode well for a less adversarial relationship between American women religious and the hierarchy than what we have seen. And I think Catholics of both sexes could benefit immeasurably from the creation of new models of female leadership at every level, in non-sacramental roles, but at the parish level, diocesan level, and even the Vatican. On that note, I was asked, sometimes when reporters ask you questions, you have to think for a minute and, and I was asked a question many times last spring and even before that in 2005, will the next pope ordain women? And I didn't have to think about it at all. I said, no. But in this sense, I was very surprised to hear what Francis had to say, and that I do hope he includes women when he elaborates on what he means by developing a profound theology of women. I think perhaps the longer history of Catholicism may be operative here, far outside the history of the United States, in the sense that this issue presents him with an opportunity to take another page from his namesake. Francis of Assisi listened to, collaborated with, and learned from a woman of deep faith, and I think that there are lots of modern-day Claires out there who would be very welcome, very interested in having a place at the table. Thank you.
Let me start by recommending a change in the title. At least according to me, given that we have Peter Holland, a distinguished Shakespearean among us who introduced us, I would have thought that the title for this session should have been called From Pope Benedict to Pope Francis, Comedy, Tragedy, or Tragicomedy.
That's pretty funny.
Now, I think there's another issue as well. This issue has got to do, so there's no with my title here. Peter is English, I'm Irish, I think the war goes on. He has taken the O from me, and he has cast me as a female character in a Shakespearean play. As one looks on at the media, at the various Catholic pundits, the Vatican gossips, and otherwise talking heads, one sometimes feels that one is going to come upon sort of the compere in a very bad talent show, who is just about going to say what we've all heard so often, and now, ladies and gentlemen, for something entirely different. That might be sort of one characterization, euphoric characterization of the transition from Pope Benedict XVI to Pope Francis. Now, it's obvious that one should suspect the totally different designation. But still, on the surface and on the evidence before us, Francis is, in fact, gregarious in society, and style does matter. He is much less formal and strained in posture. He is, at least for the moment, much more transparent. He is much more open in terms of dialogue, and he's much more prepared to talk to contentious issues, even if in fact he's reporting they're closed down. And he is much less inclined immediately to recur to church position, though eventually he will get there. And lastly, and I don't think leastly, Francis seems much less inclined than Benedict, who is, I think, the great catechist of the church in the last half century, to explain church positions, not simply to announce what they are, but to give a reasoned defense of them. I think we can confidently expect that that sort of will not sort of be Francis' charism. Now, it's obviously true that Francis, from the beginning, and I think this is likely to perdure, is a much less polarizing figure than Benedict. Some of this has got to do sort of with the virtues which I've just announced, and some has got to do sort of with the perception of Benedict. Benedict, after all, long before he became Pope, has been a prominent spokesperson in Roman Catholicism for all kinds of things. He has also been a prominent member of a European church racked by scandal, in a way so that third world countries, or at least outside Europe and North America, have not been. And he has, whether justified or not, become the focal point for all kinds of neuralgia and objection, some reason, some non-reason, with respect to the Catholic Church. In that sense, sort of, it's very unlike, I think, even despite the fact that Francis will, in fact, have the same office, it's very unlikely, in fact, to attach the same amount of flack. This brings up again, I think, Brian's question. Are the differences more nearly in terms of style or in terms of substance? And obviously, as I raised that question, it's a proper question and a rhetorical question. It does seem sort of, I think, fairly self-evident that questions of style sort of or issues of style are going to divide the two figures, and issues, I think, of substance perhaps less so. So what I want to do in my time sort of is to talk sort of about more or less the, I suppose, substantial theological continuities. And I want to talk about them two different ways. One way is just to see so that the similarly aged pontiffs walking somewhat parallel from Vatican II and being receivers of Vatican II. And the second, for good or ill, depending upon where you stand, there is just simply, straightforwardly, the actual influence of Pope Benedict on Francis theologically. Benedict is something of a theological giant. He is someone sort of who had welcomed Pope Francis into the Curia, who appointed him to various offices, etc. So there is, in fact, sort of a close connection, not just simply that they're like-minded, but actually the former Benedict influences the latter. So let me actually start sort of with the first. I would say, first of all, that any expectations of substantial change probably go out the window, not simply in terms of what he said already, but simply in terms of the office of being Pope, where with the exception of John Paul II, there's generally a tendency to erase personality and a tendency towards conservation of the past. Because if the Pope does not conserve the past, one can ask the question, who possibly would? And that's going to, I think, have to set a ceiling with respect to what the expectations are going to be. And I think the second thing has got to do sort of with Francis and Benedict puzzled, inquiring into what is the status of the church? What is the nature of the church? How and in what way is the church an institution and more than an institution? And then having to ask the major question, what is the mission of the church? And within sort of the mission of the church, sort of what sort of are we going to give priority in terms sort of the present task? Let's say with respect to the first thing, what is the nature of the church? Lumen Gentium defined the church as mystery. And that might tend to be obfuscating. But I take it that one of the things that it was trying to say was that however embedded in the real world the church is, and embedded it ought to be, the church is not reducible to institution, or rather, not fully reducible to institution. The church as institution may be variously functional and dysfunctional. There's some evidence to suggest at the moment, at least not quite functional. But I also take it that the way in which Benedict and Francis interpret this notion of the church as mystery is not, I think, what we might tend to think on our rather bleak moments, a kind of immunization strategy. That is, don't hold us accountable as institution because we're not institution. Of course, that's not true. The church is institution, but the church is not absolutely reducible to institution. Obviously, the church can and should be criticized if the church itself sort of is a cause of scandal. What I think it means is that for Christians and for Catholics in particular, the object of Christian faith is Christ. The object of Christian faith is Christ. And we could be just simply that institution for whom we have a very special object. But I take it the view sort of Catholicism is, it's not simply that Christ is the object of faith. Christ is a subject of faith. That is, there is something about the church that is Christ. There is something about the church that is founded on Christ, has its root in Christ, draws on Christ, and draws on Christ in and through the Holy Spirit. And that's the theological reason why in the last instance the church is not reducible to institution. That is exactly the position of Francis. It certainly has been articulated beautifully for the longest time by Pope Benedict. The second thing is that, and the second item sort of for today as it was in the 1960s, is what is the mission of the church? And Gaudium et Spes obviously is a document that handles that. And the answer generally is that the mission of the church is to be a witness to and for Christ in a world that is variously good and not so good. But that document, and also Benedict, who might be regarded as a hyper-intellectual, but probably is not, suggests that what Christianity is not a set of doctrines, it's not a set of professorial pronouncements, that Christianity is a form of life, a form of witnessing. And that if there is a value to doctrine at all, it is that doctrine sort of regulates regulates behavior, which in turn constitutes habit, which in turn shapes a life. Francis is probably not as inclined to talk about doctrine and their shaping power. He's prepared to stipulate doctrines. But nonetheless, it does seem to me that one of the things they have absolutely in common, you might find this surprising with respect to Benedict, is that beyond all doctrines, beyond all inherited practices and forms of life, stands the figure of Christ as the ultimate criterion of fidelity. It's not the Pope, it's not the cardinals, it is not the Theological Commission. Francis says that what is defining a Christianity is one's encounter to Christ, one's encounter with Christ. As a good Catholic and a good pontiff, he's going to say that encounter with Christ, who is the norm of all faith, is an encounter that occurs in and through the medium of the Church. The second point I want to make is that Francis does follow directly, it seems to me, Benedict in a number of highly important theological matters. Outside the obvious thing, he's a pope and he's not going to give up sort of on Christian doctrine. Francis is in line sort of with Benedict's third encyclical, Love and Truth. Francis is anti-Marxist in terms of his vision of society, and he's anti-capitalist, or at least he's anti-strong former capitalist in terms of his view of economics. He is somewhat reserved about liberation theology, but not quite as reserved as for Benedict. Secondly, Francis is in line with probably one of the greatest encyclicals ever written, that is God is Love, which articulates Christianity and does insist, if we want to go back to American politics, that Christianity has got to do with the vision thing. It's everything got to do with the vision thing, and doctrines actually are secondary with respect to the vision thing. The vision that identifies Christianity is the revelation of Jesus Christ as divine, which reveals not simply that there is God, but God has this particular complexion. That this God, who gains nothing from any relationship with any of us or in a group, despite it is not in God's interest to be related to us, that all of us and each of us infinitely matter. It is on sort of that basic vision, which is articulated in that document, to which I think Francis accedes thoroughly, that we have a raison d'etre doctrine. And if we don't actually have a vision, doctrine is useless. It's an aggregate, so there's no of particular propositions which actually have no kind of central force whatsoever. I think it's not accidental that when Francis came on the scene, he used the word mercy as the indicator of Christianity. Now, we know that is the new clerisy of academics up here. We know that he didn't borrow that from Benedict. He borrowed that from Walter Casper, who sometimes is regarded as a jousting partner with Benedict. But I don't think it's sophistical to suggest that love and mercy have a great deal in common. If they're not exactly synonymous, I think one would have to be very sophistical to find the fine-grained differences. The difference, if there is any at all, is, and it's got to do, I think, with pastoral sensibility. Francis is much more nearly inclined to enjoin us rather than to present the vision with respect to its biblical warrant, its traditional warrant, and so forth, which Benedict is going to do. It's simply stated. And therefore, what we're asked to do is we're asked to perform it. We're asked to perform a vision. We're asked to be mindful of it. We're asked to execute it. Lastly, I want to just say something about Benedict, who, of course, serves as the foundation, as I've indicated here, in terms of theological substance for Francis. But, of course, it may very well be that collective Catholicism is breathing a sigh of relief. But I want to offer a certain kind of complexification. It is the case that as he ended his tenure, and obviously in extraordinary fashion, he did not die. Benedict remains, when he's not pilloried, for those who think that there's something marvelous about him, he still remains an enigma. I just want to get to some elements of that enigma as I close. The differences, I take it, between Benedict and Francis, and I agree with Brian, are largely in terms of style and behavior. So I think we should just suspend just for one moment the common caricature of Benedict, and particularly with our interest to set off the greater affability and approachability of Francis. Let's ask the question which was asked as Benedict became Pope, then Joseph Ratzinger. God's Rottweiler? Really? Now, would one or could one say that after you've read a considerable amount of him? That might be easy for me, but I'm not the subject of this. I want to end with a reference to my teaching of Benedict in the classroom at Notre Dame. Now, all of you, as you look at me, you can assume that in my real life, there never was and never will be a Tobey Maguire moment, a Tom Cruise moment of, you had me at hello. But I am incorrigible. I continue to yearn for such a moment, and of course what I've done is I've displaced it onto the classroom. If I have a chance of redemption in that particular way, or being Tom Cruise for a moment, my wife might be happy with this, you'd think that after all your years you would know better, but you're waiting sort of a day in which 3 sentences are out of you and you have your class. Now, given the difficult stuff that I generally teach, and it's not Benedict, intersection of philosophy and theology, I confess it has never happened. I sometimes come with a late run. Enter Benedict and the phenomenon, a real phenomenon. Benedict is loved immediately. You might say, well, we knew that. No, you didn't. The conservative students immediately find and love someone who is, they find, much more open than they are and much more willing to talk about the problems of faith. And the more liberal students can't recognize the bulldog that they've been expecting through all the urbanity and the reasonableness of the prose. Benedict is a Catholic thinker and leader who follows the mandate of Paul to speak boldly, and surely he has for about 50 years. And that's not easy to do. I don't think his personality is given in that way. When politically and socially you are suspect, or at least you're behind the 8 ball. And in addition, you're hobbled by self-inflicted wounds, not just simply the other guy. Now, Benedict, during his tenure as Pope, was hardly error-free in execution. But it would be difficult to deny the courage. And then we have to remind ourselves of the second, we might say, attached Pauline mandate. That is, that we Catholics are not enjoined simply to speak boldly, which sometimes means speaking stupidly. We are asked to give a reasonable and reasoned account of our faith. I'm presuming that's not redundant and will not have become redundant with his self-removal. And arguably, no one has done this, that is, has spoken with courage and given an account of the faith quite so comprehensively, quite so intelligently, quite so long, and quite so eloquently in the modern period. Thank you.
All right, we have about 10 minutes left for questions. The floor is open. Okay, yes, yes, please.
I'd like to ask, in the American Society for Women, how do you think the Pope is going to truly address what we see now, and that's that half of the society is actually very much accepting of women's role in medicine, law, engineering, and schools, they are 50, and sometimes greater than that percent women within leadership roles. And when we look at this also, we see that women in these roles do go away from the church intellectually because of the church's lack of giving these types of roles to women. And so, do you think that the new Pope's idea is to start to open this up to move us there, as opposed to saying absolutely never by a past church doctrine?
Yeah, it's really fascinating from the perspective of American history. If you were your average Catholic woman in American society from the early 19th century until the late 1960s, probably from an immigrant background in the working classes, if that average Catholic woman looked around her, where did she see the most educated, the people, the women that were doing the most meaningful work that was under the auspices of the Catholic Church and in particular religious life? Since the late 1960s, quite the opposite has been true. That, and I think of this particular student, but I could talk about many who talked to me about the disconnect that these younger women are feeling between the doors, the society in which fewer and fewer doors are closed to them, and the sense that, so in other words, women have far more opportunities outside of church auspices than they do within them, which is a reversal. Catholic nuns had more power than many women under secular auspices for most of American history. So when you think about the institutions they were leading in terms of that. So how to, again, at least talk about this. And I think that many people at first go to the issue of women's ordination, and that's understandable. That is the big issue. And I think what Pope Francis the direction he may be nudging the conversation is that there are lots of other ways that he says women are not just, the church talks a lot about women as mothers. Church talks a lot about women in what roles they can perform within liturgy. But what about a deeper way in which women can be leaders? I admit this is a little confession here, but he appointed a new Secretary of State yesterday, and I have an Italian friend who emails me very early in the morning, and he said, "Did you hear the news about the Secretary of State? It's big." And I thought, maybe it's a woman. Now, again, that gives you a little idea of how much I'm thinking is possible. But is there a canon law saying that the Secretary of State has to be a cardinal? I don't know, but I'm saying there's lots of ways that you can. There are so many positions of leadership out there, so much work that needs to be done within the church in this country and broader, and that are non-sacramental roles. So I think that there is a lot you could do to kind of redress this balance, and it's something that, in taking off my professor hat for a while and thinking of myself as a mother of Catholic girls, I'd like to see them growing up in a church where if they can live their vocation not just in the secular world, but within the church. So, yes.
I have some limited experience working with young adults these days in the church, and I find them to be very fascinating, very open-minded, very multicultural, very global. There's not a sense of arrogance. My experience is good. And what I find is that there's a disconnect. And you said earlier, and I'm not sure if I agree, that they know what the church teaches.
The Pope said that. I was quoting the Pope on that.
Let's talk about this issue. For example, among my little small world of young adults, of course, gay marriage. What the heck? Who would say no to gay marriage? Of course, gay. What would make it? It doesn't make any sense to exclude that. So it's an interesting challenge. I think. I don't know that the young people today know what the church teaches. All due respect to my favorite pope so far.
On that, I think our experience here at Notre Dame, where we have many young people in our own courses, sometimes at fairly basic levels, is that things really are very varied. That a number of our young Catholics come here with a very strong and clear formation in certain things, who know the Bible well, say, and others who come from Catholic schools too, who know almost nothing. And it seems it's true in parishes and schools in many different ways that the background is something that is very variable and perhaps needs to be worked on.
And maybe it's what he meant to say, or the meaning behind it, that young people are aware of what the church's position is, but may not be familiar with the teaching about it, may not have read anything about that. That's probably what I would say, that the students I meet know what the church's position is, but might not be able to explain it.
On Raymond Arroyo's World Over, he interviewed the publisher of Ignatius Press, a Jesuit, maybe Fezio, and Bishop Merlin. And Father Fezio, if I have the name right, kind of respectfully challenged the Pope because he was saying there are so many quality opportunities for women. So I'm looking forward to the discussion, and also with the matter of the youth. I hope they are tuned in with the teachings of the church, because I have a sense there's been a loss. Maybe these hope is hopeful. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion of many issues.
About the two popes and their approach towards ecumenical outreach, which was a huge deal with Pope Benedict, I think, and this thought came to me last night when I was in our bookstore and came across a beautiful book of Benedict's writings, where the foreword to that book had been written by King Abdallah of Jordan and President Shimon Peres of Israel, of all people, and it really hammered home to me the ecumenism of Benedict. How do we feel about that for Francis?
I could just say that he has a very strong reputation from Argentina as the Archbishop of being very interested in and very open to ecumenical dialogue with many different groups, with Jewish people, with Orthodox Christians, with Protestants, different forms, different strands in the church. It remains to be seen what will happen, now. But he's been very well received by non-Catholic Christian leaders and even by Jewish leaders. And I would expect that he'd be quite positive on these things.
I think this probably gets back to a difference in tonality rather than a difference in substance. Francis, I think, has done well up to now in terms of how he relates to a particular Jewish community or a particular Islamic community in Buenos Aires. That is, so that he is a very, very pleasant person who does acknowledge and probably has a religious basis for this, that everyone is on a journey towards God, a particular kind of Vatican II view, which allows for and encourages hospitality. But of course, that's not dealing with certain questions which then subsequently emerge. In other words, that is, are we asked to behave in that way? Well, presumably as Christians we are, and the Pope is doing that. But whether we like it or not, what will happen sooner or later is someone's going to make the fairly obvious point. Well, you do this, you do that. You believe this, you believe that. Therefore, you're all the same, really. It's really all a matter of private opinion. All Francis has done, and I hope that he continues to do it for the rest of him being Pope, because the question turns out to be mischievous. But sooner or later, a Pope, and if not the Pope, some delegate will have to say, we believe that the Christian religion is true. And however relevant and however relatively true everything else is, it's not as true as that. Now, at that particular point, it looks as if then someone has, betrayed good manners. Except, of course, it will happen. It will have to happen. And once that does happen, a Catholic response is, a Muslim should not think, if he or she is a Muslim, that Christianity is true. A Jew should not think, if he and she is a Jew, that Christianity is true. They should believe, if they are members of that community, they should believe so that there is something special ultimately about that, and obviously not think about it in terms of a zero-sum game. But that question of, if we have the truth, does another community have the truth in the same way? All we can ever do is, at best, and I hope we can do, is postpone it. But it's going to come back. Benedict had to deal with that and dealt with it for 30 years.
I'm going to take the privilege of chair, as it were, to make three very quick points. The first is to Cyril and his name card. I want to quote the last line of King Lear in the book. Oh. all of you. Father Jenkins announced this week the subject for this year's Notre Dame Forum, and it is women in leadership, which echoes so strongly with one of the concerns today. And thirdly, when the cameras were surveying the vast crowds in St. Peter's Square waiting for the smoke to change colour at the Vatican, they caught sight at one point of a group of Notre Dame students holding up a sign saying, "Conclave like a champion today." You panelled like champions today. Thank you.